welcome to Stork'd the podcast, season 5, guys. I am your host, Julia, and I cannot believe that we are already at season 5. When I started this podcast a number of years ago, it was because I was in my own exploration to figure out how to have a family. I was single in my late 30s, really disappointed that I didn't have that perfect, idyllic partner, relationship, picket fence, 2.5 kids, puppy dog situation. And so I went and I embarked on a journey to figure out, okay, what do I want from my life? And so I started talking to my friends around what's it like to be a stepmom and how do blended families work? And I talked to people about adoption, and I went down the path of exploring adoption so far as even to visit Colombia and go to an orphanage that my cousin had come from and ask some questions to the person who had run the orphanage for 40 years and just say, what is adoption all about and how has it changed over those past 40 years? And then, I asked friends, what is single parenting like? Or people who chose not to have kids. What is the decision not to have kids like? What does it feel like? And those conversations, you guys, were so interesting and they were so rich and they were so deep. It's amazing to me that there's not a single person who can't tell you about their family life, whether it's the building and generating a family that's the current generation or the experience of growing up in a specific family or creating a community as family. We all have someone in our life that we call family. And when you start conversations with, can I ask you about your family? Oh my goodness, the stuff that comes out of people. And so it was so good that I turned it into a podcast. It was initially kind of a lark, like, will anyone listen to this? And then I got addicted to having these awesome conversations. And so now, here we are, season 5. It is such a good season. There's so many amazing episodes. I'm really pleased that we've got a lot of incredible authors who either have biographies or books about their area of expertise to share, including a book about a very interesting upbringing with a lesbian solo mom and father who was basically cherry-picked from a hair salon to become a sperm donor and then ended up becoming a career donor. And that's an interesting story with Krista Bilton. It's called Normal Family. We have Ruby Warrington, who wrote a book about choosing to be child-free, and just how many people have really shamed her or questioned her decision or told her that she probably doesn't really want that choice, which is so unusual that in that space we're told that we don't know what we actually want for our own lives and our own bodies. Amazing. We've got a woman who wrote a book about astrology and astrology for your kids and how to understand your kids through the lens of astrology. And we've got a book about parenting kids like a pediatrician through the lens of being a pediatrician. We've got people and entrepreneurs who have started apps in the postpartum experience and how to heal your body through exercise and movement, or how to heal your body through supplements and support nutrients. We have people who have gone through so many interesting fertility journeys, and a really incredible book from a gentleman who wrote The IVF Dad, Keegan Prue, which talks about the male perspective of going through fertility and a lot of the conversations that he and his wife had to get to the point of understanding what they wanted from their family lives. And so many episodes of regular people who didn't write books but have incredible stories to share. I am so thrilled with this season. It's a really, really good one. It's also got some interesting themes to it. I notice that every season has sometimes a theme that emerges that I never expected. And this one really blew my socks off. When I looked back at the episodes that I had recorded at the time of launching season 5, I realized that in many episodes we talk about the concept of consent. Now, if this were a podcast about sexuality or dating, I would expect that consent would be a primary subject. Or if we're thinking about how to raise children who are kind to one another, consent is a really important topic. But when it comes to family building, I never thought that consent would be a theme that emerged in this season. Last season, we talked a lot about donor conception. And we'll always talk about that because it's a point of curiosity for me. And that emerged as a theme. And in part, it was because the last season was sponsored by California Cryobank, which is where I got my donor sperm. But this season, the theme of consent came up. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We have a woman named Hee Stewart who started 2 companies. One is called Tranquility by Hee and the other is called The Birth Lounge. And all of those are around transforming the birthing experience. She is a doula and an educator, and she wants you to own your birthing experience. And so she talks about and trains people on how to have consent in the hospital setting with doctors, how to have consent over your body during your birthing experience. what you can consent to, what is legally and ethically within the right to say no to or yes to, depending on what feels right to you. Interesting, consent within birthing. Never would have thought about that. We also talk about fertility fraud. My God, this one had my blood boiling. I speak to a woman named Eve Wiley, who is, among many other things, an advocate and a force of nature to try and change the laws around our fertility journeys. And one of the things I learned is for a doctor to say, okay, I know that you want to use your husband's sperm or a donor that you've picked out and that you've consented to and that you've chosen because it's important to you. But instead, I'm going to go into a back room, masturbate, and then inseminate you with my sperm without your consent and without telling you. That is legal in most states in the country. And so we talk a lot about the consent in what your child's DNA might be and how that child is conceived has to be consensual, even with a doctor, especially with a doctor who is inseminating you. And the final one that came up is another one that I never knew existed, and that is consent to the images and the content that you post online. I speak to a woman named Amanda who writes about medical statistics and particularly was writing a lot about COVID and how to interpret COVID data and COVID statistics in the height of the pandemic. And around that time, she lost her infant son. And somebody took and misappropriated her post about losing her son and the data that she had communicated, including that she had chosen to get a COVID vaccine while pregnant, and spread the rumor that she had essentially caused the loss of her baby by getting the COVID vaccine while pregnant. And as it turns out, because she's a public figure, she doesn't get ownership or get to consent to how people use certain images or certain information that she puts out on the internet. That was amazing and fascinating, and what a heart-wrenching episode. So, as always with Stork'd, these stories are intended to open our minds to what is possible and the different ways that we construct family. It's intended to give us a sense that we're not alone. If my family looks a certain way, I'm hopeful that it is reflected in a Stork story. If your family looks a different way, then your family is reflected in a Stork story. And so opening the lens of what is possible for all of us, celebrating all families, and creating a community in which we celebrate families. We're trying to take away any stigma that we may or may not feel if our families don't look like a white picket fence family, or if our family journey building process didn't come together in the way that we had hoped, if it wasn't, a couple months of trying at home with a partner, but instead took doctors and very expensive IVF processes or donor sperm or something like that. All of this is intended to be celebrated in Stork'd, or Stork'd is intending to celebrate all the families. In fact, I've got a concept that I've been sharing broadly lately, which is the family positivity movement. Stork'd is on a mission to create a movement celebrating all families. I'm sort of modeling that after my teenage years. When I was growing up in the 90s, it was the era of Kate Moss and the emergence of the supermodel. That was the style at the time. Everyone was super, super skinny, definitely white, baby-faced, long, straight hair. Nobody had any multiracial background or any other ethnicity. Nobody had any other different body type. There was one thing that was celebrated, and that was a very, very, very skinny body type. And there was one way to look in media. It was one way that everyone looked in the TV shows. And at the time, I went to an all-girls school, and we did a lot of training around body image, body shame, and decoding the messages that the media gave us so that we could take a step back and really be comfortable in our own skin and realize that the messages that the media was giving us were not true, that we didn't all have to look like Kate Moss. And that was the early days of what now is a body positivity movement. It's a movement of people who have said all bodies are beautiful, and they're showcasing them in advertisements and body inclusivity in terms of sizes and the way clothing is cut and made, and so that we can all feel beautiful and wonderful and special about who we are, regardless of the body we carry. That's really important. And we're trying at Stork to create something very analogous. I'm calling it the family positivity movement, where we want stories and voices and images to be of all types of families, and also celebrating families that may not look the way that they hope to one day. Celebrating families that come together through fostering, through adoption, through donor conception, through all the different things. So this is what the family positivity movement is. We want kids to grow up feeling like whatever family they come from is wonderful and cherished and beautiful. One of the things, if you've been following Stork'd for some time, you will know is that this podcast has sort of traced my journey into building my family alongside the stories and voices of other people who we celebrate their family building experience. And in part, although I hate to be on this side of the microphone, it's important for me to share who I am for listeners because I'm asking my guests to share so much of themselves. So let me tell you about where I am right now. And to be honest, it's kind of a hot mess. Like, I think a lot of the seasons I was able to speak with a little bit more certainty. But where I am is I'm 18 months into a parenting journey. And I'm discovering that becoming a parent is really reshaping my relationship to myself and probably my interpersonal and romantic relationships. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. But first, let me give a little disclaimer, which is that before I became a parent, particularly when I was single and really just feeling so down about the fact that I didn't have the family life that I wanted, people would always say, wait till you have kids and then. You will really understand XYZ when you have kids. You won't fully appreciate love until you have kids. You won't fully appreciate being exhausted until you have kids. You won't fully appreciate this, that, or the other. And I resented and continue to resent that framework, that something fundamentally shifts in your life once you have kids such that the prior life is not as valid as the life with kids. And I found it then and continue to find that concept that the next stage of who you are is better. Because that therefore makes anyone who doesn't have kids, either by circumstance, you haven't met the right partner, or they're going through a fertility journey and it's not working out, or by choice, they have chosen not to have kids. That makes somebody less than. They're not fully actualized. They're not fully themselves. They're not fully whatever because they've chosen or they don't have kids. That is infuriating and patently wrong. However, for me, it is true that my relationship to myself and my romantic relationship has shifted dramatically post becoming a parent. And I'm sure you've all heard this thing that when a baby is born or adopted or brought into a family, a parent is born as well. And even though I don't believe that who I am is fundamentally better, I definitely think who I am right now is fundamentally different. And I'm kind of trying to figure out what the hell that means. I read recently, I think it was something that came up on TikTok and then was shared on Instagram, that when flamingos are raising their babies, they lose the pink color of their feathers. All that pink goes away and they take on this kind of grayish, dullish color palette. That's interesting because it's the thing that we think makes flamingos fundamentally a flamingo. When my son, who's 18 months old, points to a flamingo, he knows it's a flamingo because it's pink and because it stands on one leg. In the same way that he knows an elephant is an elephant because it has big ears and it's really big and it's gray and has a big trunk. So basically what we're saying is there's an animal in the animal kingdom who loses its self-identity by becoming a parent for some period of time, and then the pink comes back. And this is an interesting analogy for human parenting, which is that there's something about who we are that can change, that can have this seismic shift after having kids. And I struggle with this, right? Because the pre-baby me says, oh my God, that's so ridiculous. I am the same person now that I was before, and resists that comment, wait till you have kids. And I think that's really an accurate description of the first early years of parenting. In the same way that because I carried a child, which by the way isn't better or worse, it just is what my path was, my organs got reorganized, right? When you're pregnant, there has to be room for the baby somehow. And as the baby grows, all your organs get shifted. And so the liver kind of moves over there and the appendix sort of moves over there. And I'm just naming the few body parts I know. A doctor will tell me that those are not the actual organs that move. Maybe it's your digestive tract or something like that. But whatever, the concept is that your body parts move, your organs shift around to accommodate the growing child. And then what happens when the child leaves your body? Those organs don't just quote unquote snap back to exactly where they were before. They're forever changed. And in the same way, my mental and emotional state has sort of been reshifted, reorganized, and is forever changed. It's lost its pink. And I think I'm sort of figuring out, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm not a flamingo anymore? Does that mean I'm a swan or a duck or, some sort of, other animal? I'll say a few things about my relationship to myself. And that is, there's this perception that you're not supposed to change after having a kid. It's not okay to lose your sense of self when you become a parent. If your style is a little, schlumpy or frumpy, or if you're not doing the fun things that you did before, that's somehow bad. That you should enjoy the same things and that you should immediately get your body back, bounce back culture. And you should immediately love the same things that you love. And you should go out as much with your friends as you did before. Just get the babysitter. And I don't really understand that. I don't understand why this concept of quote unquote losing yourself, of shifting from pink to gray, is a bad thing. Right now in early parenting, I'm really leaning into it. I'm enjoying the dinners at home and reading bookies and the bath time and the tantrums. Nobody really enjoys the tantrums, but I'm enjoying the part of parenting where I'm discovering a new sense of self and I'm exploring the world together with my son. And I really don't like the moments where it's just me and he's not in my arms. And that meant, maybe I didn't do some of the quote unquote self-care things around working out all the time and going out with friends all the time and making sure that I retained my old life. So for me, I've really enjoyed the process of losing the pink in my feathers and just accepting that my feathers are going to be kind of dull and lifeless for a little bit. And I'm wondering why that's a bad thing. And so what's happened is this sort of sense that I probably should be doing things differently. I probably should be retaining the pink color of my feathers. I'm going to beat this analogy to death, so bear with me. And yet I'm not. And I don't understand why I'm expected to be. And I don't understand why it's a bad thing. I do have a vague sense that at some point in the near future, I'm going to wake up with having lost myself so completely that I just won't know who I am anymore. And you hear about that happening to people whose kids are a little bit older. And so one of the questions I have, or points of curiosity, is like, is this me? Have I lost myself completely? And am I okay with that? Is this part of just having young kids? Is it something to do with being a solo parent where the responsibilities, the financial burden, the responsibilities to make sure that, food is on the table, that if something breaks in the house, it's fixed, that the house is clean, that his emotional and physical well-being is met, that the babysitters are scheduled? Is the losing the pink because I'm a solo parent? Is it because I'm an older parent and therefore I kind of don't necessarily want to go back to partying in the way that I was in my 30s? Is it because of the pandemic, because we're all locked in our homes? Is it a personality choice? I'm not quite sure. And I'm also still, as I said, not quite sure it's a bad thing. I do think this whole concept that you have to do it all, you have to work really hard, take care of your kid, make sure the house is clean, make sure everything's good, and that you should also somehow have time for self-care is baffling to me. So that's where I am right now. It's just this complex mix of not any self-care, very little balance. And for right now, I'm okay with that, I think. So I reserve the right to change my opinion about this, but at the moment, I'm just sort of enjoying the gray feathers, I guess. Be very curious from listeners what your experience with this is and what you attribute it to. The other thing I'll say that changed for me is my romantic relationship. And this one's going to be a lot harder for me to talk about, in part because I haven't shared broadly with the Stork'd audience that I was in a romantic relationship. It seems a little oxymoronic to say, yes, I was in a romantic relationship, and yes, I am a solo parent. As it turns out, just before going through the process to become a solo parent, I met somebody who was so special. I thought, this person could be my person. This person could be forever. And I live on the East Coast. He lives on the West Coast. We met because he was working on the East Coast, and so traveling back and forth a couple times a month. This was pre-pandemic. And a divorced gentleman with 2 kids. And so, he knew very, very early, I think date 1 or 2, that I wanted to have kids. And we together had a lot of conversations, and we talked about how much I wanted to have a child and how much he did not or was not ready for any more kids in his life. So I said, okay, I'm going to embark on this solo parenting journey. And if you don't want to stay involved in a relationship with somebody who's actively trying to have a baby, that is an absolutely appropriate choice for you to make. So we each made our independent choices. I chose to have the baby. He chose to stick with the relationship. And it wasn't a one-time decision. So this continued. Every month we'd recommit to our respective decisions. Yes, I'm continuing down the solo parenting journey. Yes, he was going to continue to participate as a emotional partner, but not as a biological partner. And that continued ultimately through pregnancy and then through the first year and a bit of my munchkin's life. Unfortunately, Also, what happened was a pandemic. And so suddenly it became really complicated to travel. And for instance, his kid's school had a rule that if you traveled out of state, you had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And so as a divorced parent, that meant possibly quarantining away from your children for 2 weeks. That was not an acceptable choice, for a visit with me. And when I was going through various pregnancy moments, early pregnancy, there was a little complication. And so I couldn't get on a plane for 5 months. My doctors and I discussed it and it just wasn't a choice. So there was a lot of time that we were not able to see one another, which definitely contributed to a lot of strain and stress in the relationship. And then there's this issue around now that I've had a baby, I never anticipated that I wouldn't be the exact same person when we started dating. Now I'm maybe somebody different. And so maybe it was the pandemic and the travel constraints placed on two people who lived across the country from one another, both with respective families, or maybe some other stuff like an identity shift that I was going through. That relationship is either unwinding or has unwound at this point, and I'm feeling a lot of mixed emotions around it. A lot of rage, a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment, a lot of sadness, some more rage and frustration. When my last relationship ended, my last significant relationship, I felt this overwhelming sense of despair and sadness. I felt a lack of worthiness, and I felt really lost because I felt like all of my chances of having a family were gone. And so mixed up in the end of that relationship was this sense of feeling like I didn't get to have a family, that all my dreams were crushed. And I had to work through a lot of that sadness and that sense of self-worth that came along with the end of that relationship. In fact, if you've followed me since season 1, you know that this relationship was in part the genesis for this podcast. And definitely was the thing that set me on the path to going down the solo parent by choice journey. And now with this most recent relationship, where it's sort of in that murky in between, most likely at the end of the relationship, I'm not feeling the same sadness, in part because I know that I am capable of doing hard things and I am capable of building the family of my dreams on my own. I mean, just look, I have the most incredible son. Instead of being in a relationship because I was following all the correct steps, dating somebody for a period of time, eventually getting married, starting a family, I was in a relationship because I chose that person, because I loved that person, because I thought he was really special, not because I needed the family. I did that on my own. So I'm walking away from this relationship with a deeper sense of self-confidence and self-worth than I previously have. But instead of feeling sadness, I'm feeling rage. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm frustrated at the situation, at the logistics, and the circumstances that I feel have been barriers in the relationship. I'm very frustrated at what I perceive as hypocrisy and lack of compromise. I'm frustrated that in part, maybe my transition to a mom and my new identity and the shift from pink to gray feathers has contributed. I don't know, there's a lot of big emotions that I'm experiencing that I'm trying to process. And I'm also processing a little bit of hope that maybe this is not completely over forever. Maybe that's a really naive thing to say on a podcast. We'll see. I also know with certainty that going down this path was the absolute right choice for me. When I picked up my son from his crib this morning, I picked him up and I said, "I love you so much." And he said, "I love you." And I'm going to tear up just saying this. He's 18 months old and he said, "I love you." And how do you not know in that second that this is, despite the compromises made in the relationship and despite where that stands right now, that this was the absolute right choice for me and for my family. And so there's a lot of sadness mixed with a lot of pride and happiness for where I stand right now. And I don't know what to do with the rage. I've never felt that before. The reason I'm sharing all this, not to air dirty laundry, is because my story is not actually that unusual. It seems weird, right? To be embarking on a fertility journey to become a parent while also dating somebody across the country who has his own kids. And yet that story isn't actually that unusual in the solo parent by choice community. And so I'm choosing to be a little vulnerable in this episode, in part because I know so many solo parents by choice face the same question that I faced. When you go on the message boards, a really common thread is somebody who's just met a new person and they're in the process of going through fertility. And the question becomes, do I put my fertility journey on hold and test out the relationship? Do I pursue the fertility journey? Do I do both? And in my case, I attempted to do both. And it's led to a very complicated mess. And that's okay. More to come, I suppose, in future Stork'd episodes. In the meantime, here is season 5. I really hope you enjoy it. Let me say a couple things quickly, which is that listener support is so valuable. If you like an episode, share it with somebody who might benefit from it. If you like Stork'd generally, share it with the world. We are in social media. You can follow Stork'd on Facebook or Instagram and sometimes LinkedIn. You can also rate and review Stork'd wherever you listen to podcasts, and I highly encourage that because it gets more listeners to discover the platform. So I hope you enjoy it. It is intended to be a choose your own adventure. You don't have to listen to every episode. Pick the topics that resonate with you. There may be a topic that you don't think is going to resonate with you, but it surprises you and how much you relate to it. And let's celebrate all families because all families are truly beautiful. Here is Stork'd Season 5.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Karol. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.